Today's submitted material explores the ideological fracturing of the modern conservative movement, examining how figures like Candace Owens and geopolitical strategies from Russia and Iran are, reshaping political alliances and attitudes toward Israel.
Right. It is such a rich, urgent look at political realignment, honestly. But to get right into it, we need to talk about tightening the core narrative and deepening the analytical rigor, because the material introduces a wealth of compelling observations regarding domestic media shifts, Russian geopolitical strategy, and Iranian ambitions. But it lacks a singular, explicitly stated thesis to bind these disparate elements together.
Yeah, it does feel like it jumps around a bit.
Exact. It jumps abruptly between localized domestic politics like the Thomas Massie race and the woke right to Alexander Dugin's influence in Russia, and then suddenly over to Iranian regime change. Because these ideas are presented somewhat episodically, the overarching argument feels scattered.
It leaves the reader to do the heavy lifting of connecting the dots.
Yes. So the author should establish a definitive, unifying framework early on in the piece, such as the deliberate internal and external destabilization of Western institutions to serve as a structural spine that connects all these actors.
Like stating up front that the piece is an examination of asymmetric ideological warfare?
Exactly that. They need to explicitly link Dugin's stated strategy of dividing America from the inside directly to the shift in rhetoric from media figures like Megyn Kelly and Candace Owens. That demonstrates how domestic audience capture and foreign psychological operations feed the exact same ecosystem.
Wait, before we move on from those domestic figures, there's that opening claim where the author says the woke right are simply leftists. Is that actually accurate?
That's a great point. It's definitely a slight oversimplification.
Right. Because if we reframe those figures as anti-establishment opportunists instead of just leftists, doesn't that create a much stronger, more logical bridge to the section about Russian demoralization tactics?
Oh, absolutely. Dugin doesn't care if they are left or right, he just wants chaos. But speaking of those opportunists, while the piece effectively critiques the opportunism of media figures turning against established conservative positions, it overlooks the underlying audience anxieties that make these ideological pivots so profitable.
I was thinking about that, actually. If these commentators are just leaning into whatever is disruptive, they're kind of acting like weather vanes rather than wind makers,
That is a perfect analogy.
They point in a new direction simply because the wind shifted. But right now, the draft just attacks the weather vane.
Yeah, dismissing commentators as merely seeking clicks, acting out of jealousy, or being mentally unstable fails to adequately engage with the strongest potential counterargument, which is, why are their audiences so receptive to this isolationist or anti-Zionist rhetoric, right? It leaves a gap in the logic by treating the symptoms without diagnosing the market demand.
So how do they analyze the wind itself, practically speaking?
They can strengthen the argument by exploring the specific voter disillusionment and historical context that creates fertile ground for these new narratives to thrive. For example, they could analyze how skepticism over past foreign policy using the text's brief mention of the pushback against regime change in Iraq creates a vulnerability that makes isolationist rhetoric deeply appealing to everyday voters.
Oh, that makes sense. It anchors it in recent history.
Right, and they should also acknowledge their own street interviews more deep. Use that contrast between the internet and real life to explore exactly what specific American frustration these podcasters are exploiting to gain their millions of views.
Diagnosing those deeper American frustrations definitely makes the whole thing so much more persuasive. And speaking of deep diagnosis, let's look at the very end of the text.
The theological part.
Yeah, there's this profound phrasing where the author talks about a spiritual virus that sees as its greatest enemy the Jews. It's such a vivid concept, but it feels a bit disconnected right now.
It really does. The profound theological concepts introduced late in the material, particularly the idea of a spiritual virus, feel bolted onto the end of the political commentary rather than integrated into the overarching analysis.
Right. You have this sudden shift from discussing Trump's midterm strategies and the Democratic Party's Hamas caucus straight into a deep dive into the biblical concept of Amalek and the definition of Zionism.
And it completely disrupts the pacing and tone. It reads like a jarring promotional pivot rather than the natural culmination of the author's thesis.
So how do they fix that? Could applying this ancient lens directly to the modern woke right figures we mentioned earlier be the exact creative angle this material needs to truly stand out?
Yes, that is the way to do it. They need to seamlessly weave these historical and theological metaphors into the political critique much earlier, allowing the documentary concepts to serve as the ultimate resonant conclusion to the argument.
Give me an example of what that looks like in the text.
Sure. So, introduce the concept of Amalek, the force that whispers nothing is sacred, when discussing Alexander Dugin's demoralization tactic, or the nihilism of the modern internet, right? Or when addressing the myth that Judaism and Zionism are separate, tie it back directly to the rhetoric used by the specific commentators mentioned earlier, demonstrating how they weaponize this exact comfortable lie to divide their audiences.
Wow, threading that through the whole piece would be incredibly powerful. So just to quickly recap our core takeaways for the listener. First, anchor the piece with the unifying thesis of ideological destabilization. Second, dig deeper into the audience anxieties driving these media pivots. And third, thread that powerful Amalek metaphor throughout the entire narrative.
Right. Make sure to explicitly connect foreign influence to domestic opportunism. Avoid dismissing counterarguments as mere hot air, and integrate those historical segments seamlessly into the modern political analysis.
Absolutely. We warmly invite you to implement these structural and thematic changes and submit your revised work back to the critique for another round of feedback. We can't wait to read it.